Commercial property is all about income, where residential property is all about growth. Back in the days when I started investing in real estate, like anyone else, I also started investing in residential property. Back in 2015 when I bought my first residential property, whatever I don't like, I will do some things that I really passionate about. And that was the thought process back in 2015. Like anyone else, when we didn't know, I from a first generation migrant, I came from India. I was thinking like, okay, this will be the thing, real estate, like everybody else is talking about, and particularly real estate means residential real estate. So I started investing. But about 2020, 2021, after COVID, kind of struck in my mind that, hey, the whole purpose that why I started investing in real estate is to become financially independent, and it's not working. Because even after investing 6-7 years, this is what, yes, property price gone up and I am getting a significant growth, but my main goal was to become financially independent. So what can I do to become financial independent? And then at that time, of course, I was going to different seminars, trying to find an answer, and I got that answer, which is commercial property. I realized that commercial property is the one that will make me income, that will give me enough income to become financial independent. So from 2021 onwards, I started investing, or rather I started focusing on learning into commercial property. Why commercial? Why commercial is the question that we will be answering. The first reason that I became so attached to this commercial property is the high income. High income is the reason that if I compare with a residential property can give us an income. Particularly all my residential property is giving me income about 2 to 3% net. When I'm talking about net, means after paying all the expenses and after paying all the mortgages, even though we don't calculate the mortgage, assuming that it is fully paid up, value of that property is only giving like 2% net return. So in other words, let's say 800,000 is my property price. So 800,000 is giving me 2 to 3%. So around 15,000 to 16,000 or maybe 20,000 annual net rent. When I'm saying annual net rent, means the rent that we collect in residential property, it is gross rent, and after the rates, insurance, management, land tax, and all other expenses, if there is a toilet get blocked, who is going to pay for it? That I as a landlord will have to pay for it. So I realized that with 2%, 3% net rent, and assuming that the inflation is 3% and all, and also the expenses is keep on going, it's not sustainable. I cannot become financial independent, or rather enough income to live off from my residential property. This was a light bulb moment for me. So I moved to commercial. Now in commercial property, just to give a comparison, that my first commercial property is giving me 8% net rent. Now 8% net rent is like, compared to 2% or 3%, is giving me like 5 or 6% extra net rent. Because it is giving me 5% extra net rent, it is much faster for me to become financial independence. And that is the moment I realized that, wow, this is how people become financial independent. This is how, like, buying a commercial property is my way to go. And I bought my first commercial property. That first commercial property is giving me 100,000 net rent I am getting, and I paid $1.25 million. $1.25 million purchase price with 100,000 net rent is roughly about 8% net return. On top of that, when I'm talking about net, it means land tax, insurance, management, council rates, maintenance, all these things will be done and paid by the tenant on top of that 100,000 rent. So in other words, if there isn't any problem with that, blockage of the toilet or anything that happens with that property, that need maintenance, it will be paid by the tenant, because tenant has to maintain the property. If they don't maintain, they will not get the customers. If they don't get customers, they will not be doing a good business. So their utmost interest is to make sure that the property is neat and clean and well maintained, so that they get the customers. So this was the pivotal moment for me, and the high return is one of the reasons why I actually moved, why commercial property is so lucrative for me. The next one, that it was important for me is the lease. As you know that in residential property, I always get about 6 months to 1 year lease. Yes, the tenant sometimes stays there 4, 5, 6 years and the lease gets continued. But at a time, I get only 6 months to 1 year because I don't know that after 6 months or 1 year whether they are going to stay there or not. Yes, it is possible that if they move out, then someone else is going to come in. But it also a little bit of hassle as well. What if the property gets vacant for 1 month, 2 months? It is always in residential property. Ever since in 2015, all my residential properties, it was giving me about roughly about 50 weeks rent I was collecting, and 2-3 weeks I always lost. Whereas in commercial property, it is possible to get a longer lease, and that is exactly I have done in my first commercial property. I got a 15 years lease. The previous vendor, they just signed the lease, and within about 2-3 months time, because their main goal is to get a longer lease and sell it to an investors, and then eventually I bought it. My main focus of buying this was because it's a 15 years lease, it's a long term, it's well secured, it has a director guarantee, and it also has in a nice location. So I am expecting that I will be collecting rent. Now there is no such thing or 100% guarantee, because yes, tenant can get burst, they can get bankrupt, and they can do all these things, but that is a much harder process. Even though if they call themselves bankrupt, there is a director guarantee. That means they have to, their personal assets are also become zero, and then only I will start losing rent. In commercial property, and this is something that we need to understand, that when we buy, and if it is a long-term lease and it is a well-written lease, and if it is a secured lease, I would be able to collect the rent for that many years. So it kind of gave me a security that for the next 15 years, it's kind of an income that is going to come. So long-term lease is one of the reasons that why it actually kind of gave me an idea that why I should be looking for buying, and that's how I got into in commercial real estate. So secured lease is long-term. Secured long-term lease is another reason why I actually started investing in commercial. The third reason I started investing in commercial property is the rent that gets bumped up automatically every single year, and it is written in the lease, what is called CPI increase or rental increase every single year based on as per written in the lease. In my lease, it is written 3% or CPI, whichever is greater. In the first commercial property I'm talking about, 3% or CPI, whichever is the greater. It means if the CPI stands for consumer price index, so it means like kind of an inflation. It's a government mandated percentage. Sometimes it could be 4%, sometimes it could be 2%, sometimes it could be 1%, sometimes it could be even 7%. In 2023, I believe it was around 7%. The inflation shoot up really high. In fact, government is now trying to reduce that inflation coming to the standard level of around 3%. So because of that, what happened is I got 3.5% rent bump last year because the inflation was around that time. Remember, in my lease it is written 3% or CPI increase. So whichever is higher, it means that if CPI is 4%, then I'll get 4%. If CPI is get 2%, then I'll get the 3% because 3% is higher. So it has a minimum. So either way, I will always get a rent bump, and minimum 3% that I'm going to get the rent bump. And that is exactly my point, that every single year I am going to get that rent increase. And after 15 years, I just did that calculation that after it just continues like that, it is going to go, the rent is going to shoot up from 100,000 to around 170,000 or so. So a lot of people says that the property price do not go up in commercial property. And I always tell these things. If my current rent is 100,000 and with 8% return I am getting, and the property price is let's say 1.25 million, when that rent is going to go and jump into let's say 150 or 160,000 with the same 8% return, the property value will be $2 million. It's a basic math, assuming that the rental yield or the return is still 8%. What if somebody wants to buy it in 7%? Then I will get that same property, it will be around 2.2, 2.3 million. and this is how the commercial property gets valued. This is how the commercial property goes up. My main focus was to become financial independent, and my main focus also that once I buy a property, I would not sell. And this theory, which is the theory that I actually started investing in residential property, somewhere around the line I realized that that is not going to work. This is going to be a challenging, because even though, first of all, I will not become financial independent even I buy like 20, 10, 15, 20 residential properties, because every single properties, it needs maintenance, management, it needs land tax to be paid, it is so many expenses that is there. So after paying all the expenses, it is going to be very, very difficult, that the return is always 2%, 3% as compared to the value. You could argue with me that, Soman, but you can sell this some of the properties and keep it, and a lot of people are going towards that. But yet with 100% paid up residential property, you still will get way less return as compared to the commercial property. And this is exactly that I am seeing, which is why like I personally moving all my residential one by one. So like selling residential properties, because okay, I'm done with it, I'm selling those, and then moving to commercial. Because commercial property, once I buy, assuming it's a good property that I bought, and even though it's not good property, there are so many strategies that I can use to make sure that it goes up, and I can put this some of the things which will improve the rent, which will actually increase my property value. So this was my thought process of moving from residential to commercial, because of income and because I want to become financial independent. So every single year the rent increase is kind of a addition. You don't have to think, you just have to send the invoice according to the rent bump up, and it is going to go in commercial property. Whereas in residential property, it is always, I see that even a little bit of rent increase, you get resentment from the tenant. The tenant is not happy, and sometimes they cannot pay, they will start arguing, and they'll say they'll move out, and all sort of things happened. Now bear in mind, all these residential properties that I bought, which was low socioeconomic areas, because it was cheap, go up always, which is did during, I was a bit lucky as well, because all these residential property went up significantly. It double, even 2.5 times some of the properties within the span of last 7-8 years. So now that I got lucky and I actually became like, okay, all these residential properties gone up, and I am actually foreseeing that in the future that I will not be able to get that much income from these residential properties. What can I do to increase my income, which is commercial property? Commercial property is my answer. But what I can do is just buy 3 commercial properties. That's right, 3 commercial properties in my lifetime, and I will keep those properties forever, because the rent is always going to go up and I can improve that, and all the expenses is it paid by tenant generally. So that way I will become financial independent. So in fact my goal is to always like 1, 2, 3, and these 3 commercial properties will be giving me is about, let's say, 600,000. So in other words, 1.25 million is giving me 100,000, and if my goal is, let's say, 500,000 rent to be collected, so all I need is a $6 million property portfolio. So $6 million in today's market is roughly about, it is going to give me 5 million, and that 6 million property portfolio, in my calculation, in the next 10 years it's going to go around 9 to 10 million. And those 6 million, assuming I am paying principal and interest, then it is going to go down, like my principal payment, it is going to the value, loan to value ratio, it is going to come down to around 3 million. And I would be seeing that from that 600,000 rent, that is going to go up to in 10 years time around 800 or 900,000. So rent always goes up, property value goes up, and every single year I am getting the rent that is enough to pay up all my expenses, plus, because most of the expense is not other than only the mortgage is the expense, right? Everything else is paid by the tenant. This is how the commercial property is so lucrative. This is how people who become financial independent, people who live off they live up from property, they actually have commercial property. I'm not saying they do not have residential property. Some of them probably have a mixed of some residential properties, but most of them at least bought 1 or 2 commercial property. If you are thinking that you will only be investing into residential and you will become financially independent, I am here to ask you, to challenge you to think that how you become financially independent. Do that maths calculations, project that in 5 years, 10 years time, tell me what all expenses that is going to come from that property and who is going to pay for it, and how you become financially. All right, so the next reason that actually become so lucrative for me is the outgoings. So the outgoings in commercial property, which basically means like a land tax, rates, management, insurance, all of the maintenance, these are called outgoings. Means this will be paid. Nobody, to run that business, to run that commercial property, all these things, council is going to give you rates notice, insurance, you have to take insurance if something happens, land tax, government is going to send you land tax bill, all these things called outgoings. And these outgoings, generally speaking, as per the lease, it must be written in the lease, it's paid by the tenant. Unlike residential property, all these things is landlord responsibility. And you have that moment, perhaps, just like for me also, I always think, oh my God, now that in 3 months around this time, now the council rate's coming, so I have to pay, and the rent will not cover these things for this month, or I have to pay from my pocket. I'm pretty sure that you also have the same moment. Whereas in commercial property, in my first commercial property, whenever I get these council rates, I send an invoice with the rates attached and say to our tenant, okay, now this is the rates, pay us. I paid to the council, now you pay us. As simple as that, because it is included in the lease and they have to pay for it. And this is how you realize that once you buy a commercial property, from that time onwards, there is nothing going out of your pocket. It's always coming in, because generally speaking that you will spend like, let's say 70% LVR, so 30% from your pocket. So assuming that you're getting 6-7% net return, even though you're not getting 8%, let's say you are getting 7%, you are still way off. Like the money that you're keeping, the bank will have money at the end of the month, not like you have to pay from your pocket. And this is how it is so lucrative, because outgoings is the big factor in residential properties. All the outgoings paid by the landlord. In commercial property, all these outgoings, generally speaking, paid by the tenant. This is the reason I became it becomes so lucrative. I become so used to now, thinking and buying and investing into commercial than doing this in residential. Another point I will talk about is that why I became so used to, or rather why I became so interested in commercial property is the long-term lease. I talked about my first commercial property, 15 years lease. Now guess what? It has 15 years lease plus 1 into 10 and 3 into 5. So another 25 years options. What do you mean by options? It means that tenants has a right to exercise that options. Means you can't ask them to move out. They can continue staying for another 10 plus 15, 25 years. So technically 15 years is the initial lease term. They can say no after 15 years. But generally speaking, because the property that I bought is a petrol station, and generally if you see, petrol station is a long-term lease, and once you have an established business, there is a chance that they will always going to renew that options and going to continue. Think about it. A business, once it gets established in a place, it is as long as there is a locality, as long as there are people, as long as there is, okay, there are some assumptions though that yes, petrol station is going to not become obsolete after 15 years, with so many EVs and all sort of things we are talking. But be very careful, that ask yourself the question, what kind of technology do you need with all the big trucks that will run on EVs, that will run on kind of a battery? And then how to dispose these batteries and all sort of things. Ask yourself the question. I'm not saying that you have to buy a petrol station. I'm just talking about commercial property in general, like how I became so used to it. I bought that petrol station with the initial goal is that 15 years, because once it is paid up, my property is paid up. After that, yes, if there is something happens or all, then there is nothing that I am paying from my pocket. Yes, all the outgoings that needs to be paid, but what is the likelihood that I cannot by then make it like a EV charging stations, or I can, if there's a hydrogen fuel or something comes in, then why can't I convert it? So many things that I can do, So that being said, long-term tenancy. Some of the businesses, if you buy it properly, it is possible that once you buy, you don't have to think about your generation. You have to think like your next generation is going to think about selling it, or your next generation. So if it is beyond your lifetime, so why would you worry so much? Whereas in residential property, I always find that yes, I can buy now and I think that I'll keep it forever. But those who actually owning residential property 10 years, 15 years, ask them the question, or maybe if you already have, you ask yourself the question, how much you are actually making versus how much you are losing. Yes, you are holding this property. You can tell to your mates that, yeah, I have this many properties and it is growing. But where is the income? Where is the cash flow? And that cash flow is going to hurt a lot. So having a long-term tenancy, sometimes, it is possible that you sign a lease. That's it. For your lifetime, you do not have to worry about vacancy. Now, the opposite also, it could be, case that you buy a property and a tenant can get burst and the property can become vacant. But ask yourself the question, what are the things that you can do? Perhaps you can reduce the rent a little bit and it is going to be tenanted. Perhaps you can uplift the property a little bit and it is going to be tenanted. The only reason, there are so many strategies that can be used for a vacant properties. And this is something that you can do in commercial property. Some creative ideas that you can put together, and the income is way more than residential properties. So these are the reason I became so interested in commercial property. And I breathe, I speak all the time about commercial properties, because I realized since 2015 to 2020, all the property, the whole purpose of buying all these residential properties is to become financially independent. While I got the growth, which was like a plus, which was like a gravy, unless I get the income, the growth is not going to, give me enough income for me to live off. So I'll still be used to with my job. And that is exactly happened for me. In last year, 2024, I become financially independent. I left my job. And now I do not work for anyone else. I am doing things that I really passionate about, and this is how the reason that I am documenting all these things, because I want to pass it on to my kids, to my next generation, that why I was interested into commercial and how I have done this over the period of time. So fast forward maybe 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, it will tell how I am doing with all my commercial properties. But the point that I'm trying to raise here, so ask yourself this question. Don't just listen to me like that, okay, follow Soman. Ask yourself this question, is this something that makes sense? If you already bought residential properties, is this giving you enough income? And can you project it that yes, it is going to give you enough income for the rest of your life? The question is probably not. And so you need a contrarian thinking, you need an alternative way of doing, which is the commercial property, which is where I moved to commercial property. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it gives you some value and kind of an idea of what is possible. If not, at least think that how you will become financially independent. If you think, you will find an answer. Perhaps commercial property is not the answer, perhaps something else. But definitely residential property is not going to give you a financial independence for a long term. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.